Speaker, Daniel McGree, are you there?
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are around the world. As mentioned, my name is Dan. I am an actuary. I've been working in this sort of space for probably around 15 years, but what I appreciate about this panel is that everyone's coming from a slightly different perspective or different angle. For me, I particularly work in a lot of developing countries, so all faced with very similar issue. Something that we're talking about Australia, but something that I see time and time again around the world. And even as Paula has sort of mentioned, you see various different schemes that are being set up in different countries that are trying to tackle this same issue. And honestly, I share many of the views and thoughts that have already been raised by the panelists. And I think my challenge is to try and give something unique to this session overall. And one of the things I think that I've come to appreciate is that there is a lot of work around analysis, analytics, modeling, and the technical side of insurance, but also insurance is a human business. And I want to try and talk a little bit about the sort of dynamics that I always think about whenever trying to talk about this issue and generally, and realize that for all the analysis that you can do, ultimately there's going to be a human element around decisions that are made in this space. So I try to remain as objective as possible wherever I can, but wherever I see sort of clear evidence, I tend to sort of say what I think, but I admit I haven't seen everything. So conversations like this matter so that they give people different perspectives. But one thing that I wanted to really start with is a very simple but important idea that sometimes gets lost when you're zooming into really specific issues, but is important to really having a key understanding around this, and that is around the general risk system. It's a very basic concept in which we exist, but a network of households, insurers, reinsurers, banks, and governments who all together share and absorb financial risk. So this is particularly true of catastrophic risk, but can relate to any other risk that involves insurance overall. And I bring this up because it's an important way to holistically think about the problem. Without this view, it's very easy to simply think about insurance premiums in terms of their dollar value, and also the concept of if I don't pay an insurance premium, then I save money. But in reality, when the risk is actually already in the system, by simply not paying an insurance premium, it just moves that risk from one participant to another within this system. And insurers and reinsurers, by extension, simply no longer participate in the system the way that they possibly could. So another way of thinking of this is premium price is essentially the price that we pay to have insurers participate within this system. If their participation is lost, that is because people think or feel that they cannot afford a premium or choose not to pay a particular premium, the remaining players eventually have to absorb this risk in some way, shape, or form. Whether it is a deferred risk, whether it is a risk that sometimes emerges suddenly, eventually it gets felt in the system. So whether it's through premiums, whether it's through taxes, whether it's through loss of economic activity, eventually everyone pays. So this isn't an insurance problem so much as something that is a systems problem. And one change somewhere ripples through the whole system in itself, and it requires system thinking, I believe, to try and actually overcome the issue at hand. The other aspect that is very non-technical is around the concept of risk appetite, how people perceive risk or accept risk. And I often use the analogy of bungee jumping. For one person, it's unthinkably dangerous, but for another person rather, the real risk is living with the regret of never trying. Housing's no different. Some people accept flood risk, accept bushfire risk for the lifestyle or livelihood reasons that others simply would not even consider. But there are others in society, often referred as vulnerable, that simply don't have a choice where they are. Families that live in a modest home with absolutely no alternative have a very different relationship to risk than someone who is choosing to build a house on a beach that is at risk of eroding. Policy support, in my opinion, needs to really reflect that and really focus on those who have little to no choice in terms of how they are actually functioning in this risk system overall. But I think what's important to recognize is that group in itself is growing over time and will include more people in the future, even if you try to address those who are there at present. And it's a principle that I always come back to time and time again whenever I'm talking about this, but as a bit of a general universal rule, trying to look at ways to avoid, reduce, or manage risk within a system is usually the best thing to look at first before then thinking about insurance. So insurance more so has been seen as a backstop for those risks that you simply cannot shift through one of those agreed measures. And that's not to say that it will always apply in that particular perspective, but I think as a framework, if you want to apply it, you really should be thinking about the ways to reduce risk before you start to think about insuring it. I think good information is also what helps people to make decisions that align with their risk appetite. So up here in Brisbane, people routinely, whenever they are looking to purchase a house, will, as one of the first things they do, go to check the flood risk map. I know I've done this myself personally, and things like this, but also other measures such as requiring real estate agents to disclose whether a property has been flooded previously is a positive step, but albeit a static snapshot of certain degrees of risk, so reflections of risk without full understanding. But what often catches people off guard is how catastrophe models really function in this space. And I tell friends who genuinely live on the periphery of floodplains here in Brisbane that I'm far less concerned about their next flood event and more concerned about the next time there's a model update for their insurer. With a revised model, whether it's through new data, better understanding, new methodology, to materially change the property's risk profile, how it's classified, and push premiums up noticeably, sometimes quite quickly. Different models have different answers to the same property, which sometimes doesn't build trust necessarily when you think that risk is an objective measure. However, if you look at the other side of this, whereby all models were to converge simultaneously in a very short period of time, any diversity in pricing could disappear. And that might sound positive and for overall consistency, but it also means that when the model shifts the view of risk, everyone shifts together. Therefore, those who are in those vulnerable situations will be particularly highlighted as high risk, and particularly for those boundary perils that Ray was mentioning earlier, would mean that particular regions or specific areas will be priced out almost simultaneously, with very few options left for those who live there. So catastrophe models are tremendously useful. So don't let me sound as if I'm being critical of their use, because I use them all the time, and I know that they are really, really important for trying to help people understand risk in themselves. But just to say that they have blind spots as they continue to evolve over time. One of the biggest I see as well is around compound risks. Now, hazards can morph over time. Recent examples I would see is around wildfires in particular, something that I've noticed where you focus on a particular hazard, but maybe neglect certain things such as burn scars, which create ripe conditions for flooding, particularly in other areas, but is not something that is captured in the particular model that I was looking at over time. But as I mentioned, the bulk of my work is done overseas. And in all honesty, one of the things that I've come to appreciate is that Australia is in a favourable position overall. I was in the Pacific last week, and frankly, they weren't debating how insurance will operate there. They're debating their survival, and in some cases, ultimately, the whole relocation of their communities and their country, which is sacrificing their cultural and spiritual identity. So in those contexts, when you think about how full indemnity insurance would work in Australia, there are still options available in terms of how you shape the system so it can be more effective in the role that it needs to play. That being said, I think there needs to be, it's not really a situation where there is time as a luxury and there's no need to be complacent. I have a few final thoughts that I won't go through in detail, but maybe to reiterate some of the points that were raised earlier, particularly by Ray, was things around my belief that climate change is a contributing factor without being the only contributing factor to pricing and how it is increasing. I think George also highlighted a very key part of why you're seeing certain trends overall. I believe also that this is bigger than just insurance and it's more of a systems related issue. we will all share the cost over time, and so therefore action is needed in certain regards, and it's a situation that won't go away. It's something that you'll see in the news cycle pop up time and time again, usually every 6 months, and is need for concerted action from everyone who participates in this system. I'll leave it there, but thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today.